Let me be very clear. Let me be very clear. Paul said he would slay the deficit come hell or high water, and he did.
Under his leadership, the Kelowna Accord was signed. It was an agreement that offered real hope and real change for Indigenous peoples. It should have been implemented, but it wasn't, and now we're working hard to make up for lost time.
Canada's 21st Prime Minister was honoured with a portrait in the centre block of Parliament Hill yesterday. At the unveiling, as you heard there, Paul Martin was hailed for his work as Finance Minister and praised for his efforts to lift Indigenous people out of poverty and despair. Martin drafted what was called, you may remember, the Kelowna Accord, a plan to improve health, education, housing, infrastructure, and economic opportunities in Indigenous communities. How could the deal have changed lives if it had been implemented? Is the current Liberal government on the right track when it comes to improving relations with Canada's Indigenous communities? Joining me now, former Prime Minister Paul Martin. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
Thank you for being here. Let's just talk about what that moment was like for you yesterday. Does it feel like, you made a joke about was it your grandson who said it means that you're old? But what, beyond that, what did it feel like to have your portrait put in the hall?
Well, to get the quote right, it was really, really
Really? Fair enough.
Listen, it was a wonderful day. I mean, there were friends who came from, one coast to the other. I mean, I just can't believe they all came for this, and I was really deeply touched by it. But it was a wonderful thing because I hadn't seen a lot of these people in a long time, and then to see all of these former MPs and staffers and public servants mixed in with all the new MPs. Yeah. It was a great amalgam. So I thought it was a great day, and it went on until the early hours of the morning.
Well, I'm glad you're here then today. There was a lot of praise yesterday for the way you handled the deficit, for your track record, obviously, as Finance Minister and then as Prime Minister. This Finance Minister and this Prime Minister are doing something interesting as well, pumping a lot of money, or trying to pump a lot of money into the economy, and going deep, deep, deep into the hole, into deficit to do it. What do you make of that strategy? And do you think at some point they are going to be encountered with some of the same difficult decisions that you had to make in the 90s?
No, they're doing exactly the right thing. And it's very interesting, but they're actually leading the world in this area. I mean, I do spend some time down at the IMF and some of these kinds of things. And in fact, they are doing what the IMF is recommending and other countries do. If Germany was doing what Canada is doing, the Eurozone would be in much better shape than it is. But essentially what they're saying is, when I acted, we had the worst debt ratio of any industrial country, and we were deep in deficit, but there was economic growth. So we took advantage of the economic growth to get our debt ratio down to where it's one of the world's best, at least at the federal level. And that was the right thing to do at that time. But right now, economic growth, global growth is very slow, as you know. But the second thing is, with interest rates so low, that infrastructure spending that they're going to be doing is not stimulus or make work. We need that infrastructure. There's a massive infrastructure deficit in this country. And the money they're putting into Indigenous education is something that is desperately needed. And so what they're doing is they're taking advantage of the circumstances to do the right thing.
At what point do they have to be concerned, though, about so-called structural deficit? Like, when do you start 4 years, as you know, goes by very quickly. So at what point do you have to start thinking about building that?
It's really totally related to the deficit ratio. The debt ratio, I'm sorry.
As long as that keeps going down.
As long as the debt ratio is in handle, and as long as you're investing in the right thing. If what you're doing is going into deficit deeply because you're buying today's groceries, that's the wrong thing. If you're going into deficit because what you're doing is building long-term assets, then that's the right thing. So it all depends on where the money's going.
You mentioned Indigenous people, and it's something that you talked about yesterday again. You said that had the Kelowna Accord actually, it happened, but had it actually been implemented, that the last decade would have been different. How do you think it would have been different? What would have substantively changed over the past years?
Well, take a 6-year-old going into grade 1 on reserve. If they had done it, if Kelowna had been done, that young student who would be going into high school would be reading and writing at a much higher level than they were. They'd have a much better math background, because the money in terms of education was going into primary schools to basically give those kids the same kinds of opportunities that kids are going to a school 10 miles away but didn't have to be on a reserve.
Yeah.
So we would have a whole generation of young people who would be much further ahead. And the proof of this is some of the stuff that, forgive me for talking about it, but that my own initiative has done. I mean, we've gone in and demonstrated that you can turn around in a 5-year period a huge literacy and ultimately, I believe, STEM or science deficit.
Some of the things, though, that the government has promised to do, build a new relationship. This week they signed on and said we adopt fully the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples. It seems like huge things that have to be done, and somewhat daunting. What do you think should be their priority? I mean, they want clean water, they want better housing, all those things. What should be the thing that they focus on most of all when it comes to the Indigenous people?
Well, so because of what I'm doing,
Yeah.
I'll say primary and secondary school education. Except that you can put a lot of money and you can put in training teachers and making the whole thing work, working with outstanding Aboriginal educators at the same time. But if the kids who are going to those schools are not getting decent health care,
Yeah, exactly.
then you're not going to have good education. If the welfare situation continues as it is, there's 40% of those kids who are not going to get a decent education. I'm not sure what kind of an education you get when you're drinking, when you have dirty water, or when you're living 14 families into a house for
So
one
it all has
person.
to happen at once?
Well, absolutely. I mean, put it this way. I mean, would you deny this? If would you say in the city of Toronto, okay, that's fine. You can have lousy housing, you have lousy health care, and we don't really think we can afford to pay for it? You wouldn't do that, Toronto. There would be a rebellion. And we're talking about the youngest and the fastest growing segment of our population. I mean, I think the most important statistic in the country is there are now more people over the age of 65, my generation, than there are under the age of 15. And Aboriginal Canadians are the youngest and the fastest growing segment of that under 15 area. You cannot, under any definition of morality, turn them down. But I can tell you also it's economic lunacy if you don't do it.
So when you see something like Attawapiskat happen, right, and now we are in, I think this was the 5th or the 6th state of emergency in that community, all sorts of different things, in this case, a mental health crisis, young people, 10-year-olds contemplating or committing suicide. What do you do for those communities? Your former colleague, the Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien, even suggested, let's move it. Let's move Attawapiskat. There are people that say that when communities are too remote, there's almost nothing you can do. You've got to consider bringing them somewhere else.
Any one of those communities, if in fact they had decent health care, they had decent education, and they were taught in the schools, they were taught basically how do you start a business, how do you get it going. There's a lot of economic opportunity in places like Attawapiskat, and the fact is to take advantage of it. The De Beer mines is they can work there and they can then come back, but are they going to come back to a community that's falling apart? No. But no, the fact is that you can turn those communities around, but you've got to be prepared to work to do it. I'll say something else. I can tell you the answer that I don't want to be partisan here, but the answer the previous government imposed on Attawapiskat is to say we're going to give you a lousy education and we're going to give you lousy health care, and that'll force you to move. And I'll tell you what happens. If you're not educated, you can't move.
Yeah, I should point out that Mr. Chrétien actually said some people may want to move, not that he thought that the community itself should move. But do you think that that's what ultimately happens, that the situations in those remote communities become so desperate that people say, I'm getting out of here, I'm abandoning the community? Or does that not... at what point do you say this is not sustainable as a person who's living there?
Well, it's not. First of all, it's not sustainable to empty the North. That's an important part of what we are as a country.
Sure.
What you want to do is give people the choice, and they're not going to have the choice if they don't have a decent education. And what you'll find, some will leave, many will stay, and when the ones that'll stay will build the community, and that's what we've done right across the board. I certainly think that, first of all, I think it's the wrong question. The right question is, what do we have to do to give people the capacity to build the community? And it comes back to education, it comes back to health care, and it comes back to decent water.
Yeah. Do you see a shift in the way Canadians are viewing this problem? From when you tried to get KELOWNA in place, there was obviously an openness at that time. Do you see a shift over the past decade in terms of how Canadians are thinking about this?
Well, at the time that we did Kelowna, there was a credible increase in interest. And what was happening at that point as well, some of the outstanding Aboriginal educators were coming forth and people were talking and there was a large dialogue. And all of a sudden, as soon as Canadians started, my God, there is an answer here. People started to getting interest. When the government turns its back on it, as has happened, then it becomes very hard for Canadians because there are a lot of other issues to deal with. I think that what the current government is doing by making it clear to Canadians this is a priority, yes, it's creating a lot more interest. And of course, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the whole question of murdered and missing women, all of these issues which have been in the headlines is creating a great deal more interest. I have found, I must say, in talking to young people, a far greater degree of interest than has existed before. Young people really do understand.
I want to ask you about assisted dying, only because the Sue Rodriguez case was at the Supreme Court when you were an MP, I believe, right? And now here we are back, the Parliament grappling with this delicate issue. Do you think that it is the right time for this to happen, and that the House of Commons has enough time to put the right sort of parameters around this discussion, by the Supreme Court deadline, which is the beginning of June?
I mean,
this is a long time this debate has been happening.
That's right. And is there ever a right time? I don't suppose there is, or if there is a right time, it was a lot earlier. But I mean, this is a very, very tough debate. I mean, I don't know about you, and I don't know what you think about it. I know I have wrestled both sides of the question just personally. And so, do I think the Parliament should deal with it? Yes, I think they have to, because this is what Parliament's all about. It's one of the things I talked about in my remarks, that Parliament's got, these are the kind of debates that have got to happen. And if they don't happen in Parliament, then Parliament is going to be rendered just simply an idle observer. So yes, I think they do. Do they have enough time to get it through within the time that it's been set? I'm not sure.
Yeah, and then...
Well, they just have to keep on going. They're just going to have to deal with it.
Yeah. When you look at Parliament Hill now and you see the Prime Minister's big majority and the sort of the worldwide fame that he has and people watching him, what do you think of how they're doing? I know it's going to be hard to get criticism out of you, I recognize.
Yeah, it is. I didn't really come here. But, I think they're doing really well. And that is an objective statement. And I think everybody else would agree. And I think there's a great feeling in the country. And I think that's also something they can do. First of all, they are addressing the issues that have to be addressed. I mean, the Aboriginal issue, the whole question of where do we go as a country. And I think that what they're going to have to do is make Parliament work, because the issues that governments now have to deal with, from artificial intelligence, the consequence of climate change, are the kinds of issues that are going to really shake debate in the country. These did not exist 20 years ago. This is a very different world. I think we're going through a historic period. So the government has to deal with it, and they've shown that they're prepared to. They don't believe, they're not going around saying government doesn't count. They're saying government has a role to lead. And may I just say one other thing? I also think there's another magic moment that's taking place in the country. Maybe joined to this, or maybe it's individual. But what's happening in Fort Mac? I know Fort Mac quite well. Everybody coming out of Fort Mac looking for a place to go is talking about how Canadians have opened their doors to them. I think that's one of the most wonderful things I've ever seen. I just think that there's a mood in the country, and I'm not saying this is because of, maybe it is because of the new government, maybe it's not. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying there is a mood in the country of reaching out and saying we are one. And I think it's probably stronger today than it's ever been. I think that's a tremendous, tremendous thing.
Okay. Well, that's a good place to leave it. Thank you, Prime Minister. I appreciate it. Thank you.